According to detectives, baby Emmanuel Haro may have already died before August 14, days prior to the public kidnapping story that his parents used to mislead investigators. The statement from Banfield:
the detectives say that that little baby may have in fact been killed days before that whole phony kidnapping,
marks one of the first confirmations that authorities believe the child's death occurred earlier than initially claimed. The fabricated abduction narrative began when Rebecca Haro told police she was attacked in a parking lot in Yucaipa and that her baby happened while she was unconscious. Her emotional media plea for help followed, but detectives quickly found inconsistencies. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and cell tower data reportedly showed gaps that contradicted the parents' timeline. Investigators soon concluded that Emmanuel's disappearance did not happen, as described. The abduction never occurred. Evidence now points to the possibility that the child's death happened several days before August 14. With the kidnapping story serving as a cover-up, once the parents realized law enforcement or relatives might soon notice the baby missing. The accelerated pace of the case, with Jake Haro later pleading guilty and cooperating in searches, supports the theory that authorities already knew Emmanuel was gone before the reported attack. This shift from a search and rescue operation to a recovery mission redefined the entire investigation. By the time media crews captured Jake in an orange jumpsuit leading detectives through fields near Moreno Valley, the case had become one of confirming where Emmanuel was placed rather than whether he might still be alive. Investigators are now focused on reconstructing those missing days before August 14, the critical period when the truth about what happened to baby Emmanuel may have been hidden. From August 5 to August 14, investigators believe those 9 days hold the missing truth about what really happened to baby Emmanuel. When detectives later revealed that he may have died before the supposed abduction, that single timeline became the silent center of everything. During that window, Jake and Rebecca were still moving through their ordinary routines, visible enough to appear normal, but already hiding a secret that would unravel within weeks. The early August heat in Yucaipa was relentless, and neighbors remembered hearing little from the house except the mechanical hum of an air conditioner. What appeared to be calm was, in hindsight, a vacuum with no visitors, no sound of a crying baby, and no sign of the young parents taking their usual errands. Every hour from the 5th forward mattered. Rebecca's later story about being attacked in a parking lot only surfaced after that period had ended, and the delay in reporting Emmanuel missing became one of the first red flags for detectives. Between those dates, phone activity dropped, digital footprints narrowed, and travel logs suggested movements that did not align with any credible count of a new mother's routine. It was as if the household had entered a holding pattern, waiting for something that could no longer be undone. By the morning of August 14, the narrative was already prepared. The kidnapping call was staged, the location selected, and the script rehearsed well enough to withstand brief questioning. But when investigators compared those 9 days to the family's earlier timeline, the gaps were impossible to ignore. In those missing days between August 5 and August 14, the story changed from the life of a child to the creation of a lie, one that tried to rewrite time itself.
that baby Emmanuel Haro was just 7 months when his parents pulled that fast one. And Emmanuel has not been seen since.
Those words settled like a verdict before any trial began. From that point forward, every minute of the investigation turned into a search for proof that he had ever been alive after August 5, and no such proof emerged. I went through every documented reference, every interview, every verified observation, and the pattern was always the same: silence. No one outside that household could confirm seeing or hearing the baby after that date. Not a neighbor, not a relative, not a single trace in routine check-ins or medical appointments. It was as if the world had stopped receiving signals from a life too small to defend itself. The investigators began constructing the timeline backward, stripping away each false layer of the story until only absence remained. No recent photographs, no phone calls describing his condition, no mention of upcoming milestones. Even the domestic details, formula purchases, diapers, and medical reminders ceased abruptly in early August. That absence was louder than any confession. It became the invisible testimony that investigators could not ignore. By the time Rebecca appeared before cameras describing an abduction, those missing records had already convinced detectives that Emmanuel's life had ended days earlier. The staged emotion in that plea contrasted sharply with the factual emptiness behind it. When Jake later appeared in the Moreno Valley field, wearing the orange uniform of a prisoner, the search itself no longer carried hope, it carried confirmation. The question was no longer where Emmanuel had gone, but why no one had spoken for him in those 9 critical days. After August 5th, the world kept moving, yet his existence froze in place, leaving behind a silence that investigators read as the clearest evidence of all. Forensic experts noted that decomposition odor begins on days 3 to 5. That detail, simple but devastating, defined the narrow window between disappearance and discovery. By the time investigators retraced Jake's movements along Gilman Springs Road, they knew that scent detection alone could tell the story of what had happened when words failed. During those early August days, heat and isolation created the conditions in which time itself became a form of evidence. A field that appeared empty could carry microscopic traces of human presence. A vehicle could hold air molecules that recorded the invisible. Every hour mattered because the body's chemistry changes in a predictable rhythm, and that rhythm can expose the difference between a sudden loss and a staged disappearance. Standing in that valley, I understood what the detectives meant when they said odor is the first witness that never lies. By the 3rd day, gases begin to form, subtle enough that only trained dogs or forensic instruments can detect them, but unmistakable to those who know what to look for. Between the 3rd and 5th day, that invisible transformation becomes measurable, an unseen clock marking the true moment of death regardless of any story told afterward. When cadaver dogs were deployed near the 60 freeway, their purpose wasn't just to locate, it was to verify that biological time had moved forward in a way that contradicted the parents' timeline. Science, indifferent to emotion, filled the silence that testimony could not. Those 3 to 5 days were the dividing line between deception and detection. Emmanuel has not been seen since, the reporter had said, and by then, investigators knew why. Nature had already begun recording its own account of those missing days, an account that no false confession or tearful plea could erase. When detectives finally confirmed that Emmanuel has not been seen since, I couldn't help but wonder why they had not revealed the estimated time of death earlier. They already suspected, as Banfield reported, that the little baby may have in fact been killed days before that whole phony kidnapping story. That was a quiet acknowledgement of what investigators had likely known for weeks about the existence of a hidden timeline between August 5th and August 14th. But law enforcement didn't make that interval public immediately, and there was a reason for that. Declaring a death window too soon can collapse an active investigation. It tells potential witnesses exactly what police know, and it gives suspects the chance to adjust or destroy evidence before forensic teams can confirm the sequence of events. Behind the scenes, investigators were testing every variable: temperature, humidity, scent patterns, and the decay rate consistent with early August in inland California. They couldn't rely on a single clue: the odor detected by cadaver dogs, the chemical signatures inside the vehicle, and the absence of any living trace all had to align scientifically before they could claim certainty. Releasing that information prematurely would have turned science into speculation, and speculation can unravel a case long before trial. By waiting, they controlled the narrative. The official confirmation that Emmanuel had likely died days before the kidnapping claim came only after Jake had a plea and began cooperating. That was no coincidence. Once the plea removed the need for tactical secrecy, investigators could safely narrow the timeline for the public record. The restraint wasn't indifference, it was precision. Detectives had been reading the silence of those 9 days long before we heard it on air. They just needed the evidence, not emotion, to speak first. Follow Jake and Rebecca's journey during those 10 days. Arrested at their home in Cabazon. That address became the first fixed point in a story built on shifting lies. When deputies moved in early that Friday morning, the quiet street outside the house was already lined with unmarked vehicles and armored units. The neighbors stepped out one by one, drawn by the noise but frozen by disbelief. To them, Jake and Rebecca had always looked like ordinary 2 parents, a modest home, nothing that foretold the arrival of a crime scene van. Yet this was the very place where the silence had begun, the house that held every missing answer from the first week of August. Inside, investigators treated each object as a line of chronology. Every unwashed bottle, every unused diaper, Each time-stamped receipt became part of a living calendar. The air conditioning still ran, masking what time had already changed. Officers noticed a faint chemical sterility, too clean, too fast, as if the space had been scrubbed of sound as well as scent. Nothing about that morning felt spontaneous. It felt rehearsed, as though both parents knew this knock would come. The phrase "arrested at their home in Cabazon" sounded simple on television, but for those standing in the doorway, it meant the case had come full circle. That house was more than a backdrop. It was where the gap between and performance first opened. From its small front window, they could see the highway that later led investigators to the Moreno Valley field, and it was from this same doorstep that social workers had once removed another child for safety. Every road, every timeline, every unanswered question led back here. The home in Cabazon wasn't just a location, it was the origin of a silence that investigators would spend months trying to decode.
10 days now. His mother said she was attacked in the parking lot of a Big Five store, knocked unconscious. When she came to, the baby was gone.
That was the stage where the story officially began, though the performance had been written days earlier. I remember watching that footage, the wide asphalt lot framed by bright storefront lights, a setting too ordinary to hold such a dark invention. Rebecca stood there in front of cameras, her voice trembling just enough to sound believable, claiming she'd woken to find her baby gone. Every detail of the supposed stranger, the sudden blackout, the plea for help was constructed to redirect attention away from Cabazon, back to a public space where sympathy could drown out suspicion. When investigators arrived, the inconsistencies were immediate. There were no tire marks, no witnesses who saw anyone approach her vehicle, no security footage matching the account. The baby seat in the car was empty, but spotless, as if it had never been used that day. The shopping center's hum of traffic and voices carried on while detectives mapped the coordinates, realizing that this parking lot was less a crime scene than a stage set for misdirection. Each item inside the vehicle told a quieter truth: folded clothes, prepacked supplies, nothing left in haste. Standing in that space later, I understood how the illusion worked. The choice of a public location wasn't random. It offered the noise and movement needed to conceal a lack of evidence. To say a child vanished from a crowded place invites immediate sympathy and creates distance from the real site of harm. They said the baby had been taken, the anchor repeated. But the ground told another story, one without struggle, without chaos, without proof. The Big Five parking lot was not where Emmanuel disappeared, it was where the lie began breathing on its own.
Escorted by deputies, that is Jake Haro, in a prison jumpsuit, assisting search and rescue crews near the 60 freeway in a field off Gilmore.
That image, caught by Air 7's camera, showed Jake Haro in a bright jail jumpsuit, walking in slow, deliberate steps beside the deputies. Moreno Valley stretched wide around him, sunburned earth, brittle grass, and the dull shimmer of heat rising off the freeway. It was the kind of landscape that holds sound without echo, a place where every footstep feels heavier because of what it represents. Jake wasn't there as a father searching for his child. He was there as a suspect retracing the geography of a secret he could no longer contain. The field itself felt almost suspended in time. The air carried that faint chemical dryness that lingers after weeks of heat. Investigators spaced themselves methodically, moving in arcs, guided by cadaver dogs that threaded between brush and dirt. From above, the pattern looked like slow choreography, each officer sweeping, pausing, marking, advancing again.
Springs Road, this is in Moreno Valley. This does not bode well for anyone holding out hope that that baby might be found alive. Emmanuel.
The reporter said, and those words hung over the field like a low ceiling. Watching that search unfold, I realized the contrast between silence and movement had become the essence of the case. Every step Jake took was both an admission and a performance. He knew where to walk, when to stop, what not to say. The officers, cautious but composed, watched his gestures more than his words. The field in Moreno Valley wasn't just a search site, it was a map of guilt drawn in real time. There, under a sky too wide for comfort, the story turned from a mystery into confirmation. The father was leading them not toward hope, but toward the truth he had buried.
This week, we do have a map of the 3 locations that are in question here. Yucaipa is where the parents said the babies were kidnapped. You see on the northern part of the screen, Cabazon is where the family lived, and I believe that's where they were placed under arrest this week.
Those coordinates became the backbone of the entire investigation. 3 points connected by a thin stretch of highway and an even thinner thread of truth. When I trace them now, I see not distance but sequence: Cabazon, where the silence began; Yucaipa, where the lie was staged; and Moreno Valley, where the pretense finally broke. Each point marks a different phase of concealment, a journey outward that mirrored the unraveling of control. Cabazon was the starting pulse. The small home tucked near the freeway exit looked ordinary, yet it was where time stopped for Emmanuel. Everything after that house was choreography. From there, the road to Yucaipa spans less than an hour, yet in narrative distance, it is enormous. That parking lot became the false origin, a convenient public setting that rewrote geography. By placing the story there, the parents attempted to detach themselves from Cabazon, replacing reality with a performance designed for immediate sympathy. Then came Moreno Valley, the endpoint that was never meant to exist. The drive from Cabazon to that field covers roughly 30 miles, but symbolically it crossed the entire arc of deceit. Each location unfolded the next. Cabazon held what was hidden, Yucaipa created the illusion, and Moreno Valley revealed the collapse. Looking at the map, the line between them isn't just a route, it's a confession drawn across Southern California. 3 points, 3 lies, and one unbroken silence stretching from a quiet neighborhood to a dry field where truth could no longer be postponed. The map didn't just show where the story happened, it showed how it unraveled.
Investigators found inconsistencies in their story.
But the real inconsistencies were not in words, they were in data. When detectives began pulling the vehicle's GPS records, phone logs, and toll transponder history, they were no longer chasing emotion, they were chasing coordinates. The car had already told them where to look. Every ignition, every pause, every digital heartbeat recorded by the navigation system built a hidden itinerary that no one could edit. From Cabazon to Yucaipa, then north toward Moreno Valley, the movements formed a pattern far too calculated to be random. I've learned that machines remember what people try to forget. Investigators downloaded the Tesla-style GPS module, extracting precise timestamps that showed when the vehicle left home, how long it idled, and which exits it took along Interstate 10. The data revealed short stops near desolate turnouts, pauses that made sense only in retrospect. At the same time, the family's phones were mapped through cell towers. The devices moved in tandem for most of that week, then suddenly separated during the window between August 8th and August 10th. One device stayed active near Cabazon, the other pinged briefly along the 60 freeway, then went silent. That silence matched the hours investigators now believe marked the final transport. Even the toll road system added another layer. Automatic license plate cameras logged one crossing in the early morning, returning hours later by a different route. It was a closed circuit disguised as an errand. Each digital trace contradicted the claim that Rebecca was attacked unexpectedly. Instead, it showed coordination, travel without panic, timing without urgency. When detectives laid the GPS path over the physical map, it aligned almost perfectly with the 3 known locations: Cabazon, Yucaipa, Moreno Valley. The line was unbroken, mathematical, and damning. Machines, indifferent and exact, preserved what human memory tried to erase. In the end, the car, the phone, and the toll record became a silent trio of witnesses, each confirming that the truth had been moving on autopilot long before anyone called for help. Jake Haro, the only person who knows the location. That was how the broadcast opened that morning, and for a moment, the image didn't seem real. The father of a missing child, now a prisoner, walking among deputies and cadaver dogs in the open heat of Moreno Valley, it looked less like a search and more like an act of consequence. August 24th was not just another date on the calendar, it was the first time Jake faced the physical landscape of what he had tried to hide. The field stretched endlessly, an expanse of dry soil, low shrubs, and the metallic shimmer of the 60 freeway cutting across the horizon. Everything about that place felt deliberate, as if it had been chosen for its emptiness, a space that could absorb secrets without echoing them back. From the helicopter footage, I could see the geometry of the search. Deputies moved in a line, steady and slow, their shadows falling across the pale dirt. Jake walked slightly apart, his posture tense, his face turned downward. The bright orange of his uniform cut through the brown field like a marker no one could miss. The anchor said, and the sentence fell with the weight of finality. At that moment, the story crossed from theory to evidence. I tried to imagine what it felt like to stand there, surrounded by silence, except for the occasional bark of a dog or the short bursts of radio chatter. The temperature had already passed 90 degrees. Dust clung to the cuffs of his jumpsuit as he traced the path he had once driven in freedom. Investigators watched him closely, their notebooks ready, measuring not just distance but reaction where he hesitated, where he turned, where his breathing changed. Each movement held potential meaning. The presence of the highway patrol and the sheriff's department created an atmosphere of containment, as though every possible exit, physical or psychological, had been sealed. They weren't searching randomly, they were following the invisible logic of guilt. The cadaver dogs, trained to read what the air remembers, circled in widening arcs. Every so often, one would pause, nose lifted, waiting for a signal from its handler. Jake's eyes followed those pauses. His silence was louder than the engines in the distance. By the end of the afternoon, no discovery was announced. The field remained unchanged, its surface unbroken, but something had shifted beneath it. The visual of Jake leading the team across the same terrain he once tried to erase had already become symbolic. It was the point where geography turned into confession. The reporter repeated, but the phrase barely captured the gravity of that image. On August 24th, in the punishing light of the desert, Jake wasn't helping them find his son, he was helping them find the truth. Escorted by deputies. That phrase, so brief in the report, carried an entire weight of meaning. Jake was no longer a man walking on his own terms. Every step he took through that field in Moreno Valley was bounded by uniformed officers at his sides, marked vehicles at the perimeter, and cameras in the air. The visual from Eyewitness News captured it clearly, a small figure in orange surrounded by the geometry of law enforcement, his movement permitted but never free. The line between cooperation and custody had vanished. He was both a participant and a prisoner, walking through the scene of his own undoing. The escort wasn't just for security, it was a statement. Deputies kept their distance measured, 2 paces on each side. A third behind, a fourth ahead, forming a silent cage that moved with him wherever he went. The coordination looked effortless, but it was intentional. Every shift of his shoulders, every glance toward the brush line, was mirrored by their vigilance. The officers didn't need handcuffs to remind him of the limits. The formation itself was confinement. Even when he pointed toward a patch of uneven soil, or paused near the drainage ditch, the deputies stayed close, ready to redirect him if his body language hinted at retreat. I watched the footage frame by frame later that evening. The sun was descending behind the hills, painting the valley in copper light. Jake's hands were free but useless. The posture of a man who knew there was nowhere left to hide. The contrast between his bright uniform and the muted landscape made him look like an annotation in the middle of a report, visible only because the scene required him to be. The deputies didn't speak much, but their silence was procedural, not emotional. It said everything. You're not leading us, we're leading you. From the air, the movement looked almost choreographed, a slow migration across an empty grid of land. The orange figure advanced, flanked by the law that once pursued him. To the casual viewer, it might have appeared cooperative, but to those who understood investigative procedure, it was containment disguised as guidance. The moment Jake tried to alter his path, a deputy's arm shifted forward, gentle, but absolute. His autonomy had narrowed to a corridor of dirt no wider than a sidewalk. The footage ended with him standing still, officers close-inkle as another team recorded GPS coordinates of the area he indicated. Escorted by deputies. The anchor repeated, and the words felt final. It was more than physical restraint, it was the embodiment of consequence. Jake could walk, speak, even gesture, but every action now belonged to the investigation. Freedom had not been taken in a single moment, it had been reduced, measured, and finally sealed in the dust of that valley, where his silence spoke louder than any admission could. Fully cooperating. The lawyer's phrase sounded almost polished, meant to convey calm, but to anyone who had followed the case closely, it suggested something more strategic, a quiet signal that information was about to shift. Cooperation is never just about compliance, it is often the first stage of negotiation. When Jake's attorney stood before the microphones and used those words, it wasn't a simple reassurance to the public. It was the beginning of a recalibration, a recognition that the original narrative had collapsed, and that survival now depended on selective truth. Inside an interrogation room, fully cooperating usually means controlled disclosure. The suspect agrees to talk but only along prearranged lines. pacing the release of details to gauge the investigators' reactions. Every sentence is a test balloon, measuring what law enforcement already knows. Jake's cooperation began shortly before he was brought to Moreno Valley, and by then detectives had enough digital, geographic, and forensic data to corner him without saying a word. His lawyer understood that silence would no longer protect him, shaping the story. The phrase therefore became a shield, one that reframed surrender as strategy. From my perspective, cooperation at that stage was not compassion or remorse, it was arithmetic. By appearing helpful, Jake could try to influence sentencing, shifting himself from defiant to redeemable. He is fully cooperating with authorities, the attorney told reporters, yet those words also implied that earlier statements had been false or incomplete. Changing information under the umbrella of cooperation offers plausible revision. What once was denial can now be portrayed as confusion. What once was omission becomes clarification. When Jake stepped into that field flanked by deputies, his lawyer's statement had already prepared the public for a rewritten truth. Cooperation allowed the timeline to be adjusted, without admitting deceit. It turned confession into currency. For the detectives, this was progress. For the defense, it was leverage. Both sides understood that information, once withheld, becomes most valuable when traded at the moment of desperation. Fully cooperating was therefore not closure, it was the sound of a story being rearranged under pressure. A man testing how much truth he could afford to tell before the silence finished speaking for him.
But both of them are due back in court November 3rd. Jake for sentencing and Rebecca for, I don't know.
That single line from the broadcast sounded procedural, almost routine. But for Jake Haro, it marked the narrowest and most critical window left in his story. The sentencing hearing on November 3, 2025, is not just an administrative date. It is the golden time to declare a position, to decide what version of himself he wants to present to the court, and to the public that has already formed its own quiet verdict. Everything that came before the confession, the field search, the lawyer's claim of being fully cooperating, has led to this moment. I've learned that sentencing isn't simply the conclusion of a case, it's a stage performance of consequence. The prosecution will stand with evidence and timelines that have already spoken louder than testimony. The defense will try to rebuild the fragments of character, weaving phrases like remorse and cooperation into something resembling redemption. Jake will stand between those opposing narratives, neither free to rewrite the past nor able to deny it. The tone of his final statement, if he chooses to speak, could determine decades of his life. Judges remember not only what is said, but how it is said, the pauses, the eye contact, the acknowledgement of harm, the absence of denial. Between now and that date, his attorney will shape the posture of his guilt. Every phrase submitted in court filings, every adjustment in tone, will be designed to show transition from deception to recognition, from resistance to acceptance. For investigators, November 3rd represents a psychological checkpoint. If Jake remains evasive, they know there are still undisclosed details. If he admits the fuller timeline, they can close the circle around Rebecca's pending case. His position will not just define his future but hers, because their narratives cannot diverge indefinitely. From the outside, the hearing will last only a few hours. Inside, it will measure 2 months of silence against a year of investigation. He is due back in court November 3rd, the reporter had said, but beneath that line lies a web of unspoken calculations. The court will listen for more than apologies. It will listen for alignment. Whether Jake chooses confession or self-preservation, that day will decide which version of truth becomes permanent. In legal terms, it's sentencing. In human terms, it's the moment when every withheld word either saves him or seals him.
Because he changed his plea from not guilty to guilty.
When Jake Haro accepted a deal for second-degree murder, the trade was not only legal, it was transactional in its deepest sense. Behind the phrase plea agreement lay a darker arithmetic. The possibility of revealing where Emmanuel's body was in exchange for the chance at a finite prison term, instead of life without release. I understood that in cases like this, a body becomes a form of currency, the final piece of leverage a defendant can offer when all other bargaining chips are gone. The prosecution's strategy was straightforward. They had circumstantial evidence strong enough to prove homicide, digital records, the false kidnapping report, the search in Moreno Valley, but without a body, the case risked endless appeals. A recovery would close the gap between theory and proof. Jake's defense team knew that. They read the file, measured the risk, and turned cooperation into collateral. Fully cooperating, his lawyer had said, a phrase that sounded noble but was built on negotiation. Cooperation in exchange for certainty, location for leniency. From my perspective, this moment defines the moral inversion that true crime cases often expose. The same man who once concealed the truth could now dictate how much of it he was willing to sell. By offering to guide investigators toward remains, he wasn't confessing to conscience, he was calculating survival. The law accepts such exchanges because closure for a family and confirmation for the record sometimes outweigh the purity of punishment. It is a compromise written in quiet language, where justice bends toward practicality. If the plea holds, the charge of second-degree murder acknowledges intent but spares deliberation. It allows the court to move forward without reopening the trauma of a trial. Yet every time I read that line, he changed his plea from not guilty to guilty. I hear the unspoken condition attached. Tell us where he is, and we'll tell the judge you helped. The deal transforms a hidden act into evidence, and a life sentence into decades. It's the legal system's version of exchange, an imperfect symmetry between truth and time. When the courtroom doors open on sentencing day, what began as deception will end as negotiation. The body, if recovered, will not only answer the question of where, but also why the state agreed to lessen the charge. A plea deal like this doesn't rewrite guilt, it merely repackages it, converting silence into a final, measurable confession. Modern search technology and means.
Part of the effort to bring another level of resolution to the mystery of what happened to the baby.
That was how the report phrased it: calm, procedural, almost optimistic. Watching the footage, I saw handlers leading their dogs across the dry fields near Gilman Springs Road, their leashes taut, their movements practiced. Everyone hoped the air would give up its secrets, that the dog's precision would succeed where technology and confession had failed. Yet as the hours passed, the hope dulled. The animals swept back and forth through the brittle weeds, noses to the ground, circling, pausing, resuming, but nothing broke the stillness. I remember standing at the edge of that field, realizing that absence can feel heavier than discovery. The scent of dust, fuel, and heat overpowered everything else. For all the training these dogs receive, for all their history of finding what human senses can't, the environment matters. The inland valley in late August is brutal. Temperatures climb, wind shifts unpredictably, and scent molecules dissipate before they can anchor. Each minute under that sun erased more of the evidence that might once have lingered. The handlers knew it. Their faces showed it. They were performing a search that science said should work. But nature refused to cooperate. Still, the optics mattered. The sheriff's department wanted to show that every tool had been used, every inch of land calmed, every sound of doubt silenced by action. Cadaver dogs were part of the effort to bring another level of resolution. The reporter said, but that resolution never came. The footage cut to a wide shot of deputies walking the perimeter, vehicles idling in the distance, the dogs moving in slow figure eights across the soil that yielded nothing. By sunset, the field was the same as it had been that morning, empty, indifferent. The dogs returned to their crates, handlers silent. The search logs would later record it as no result, 2 words that spoke volumes. Forensic precision had met environmental erasure. In the end, the failure of the dogs wasn't incompetence, it was reality. Some places, under certain conditions, simply refused to remember. The air in Moreno Valley that day carried no story, no trace, only the faint echo of effort fading into the heat.
And this is our Air 7 video that we have right now. This is video in Moreno Valley. We saw that video a little bit earlier that had the baby's father, Jake, looking for, just with the detectives there, just searching this area, again, in Moreno Valley.
Those were the words from the AMR as the helicopter camera tilted downward over the vast plain of Moreno Valley. From that height, everything looked orderly, almost serene, but the lens was chasing a different kind of motion, the slow geometry of a search for what could not be seen. I watched the broadcast in silence, the hum of the rotor blades faint in the background as the camera began to tighten its frame, drawing closer to the orange figure walking below. The zoom from above created a strange paradox, distance gave clarity. Through the stabilized lens, the individual parts of the search, the handlers, the officers, the vehicles, the shallow impressions of tire tracks merged into a single image of human persistence. The heat shimmer distorted the edges of the field, making it appear as though the land itself was breathing. Each adjustment of the camera revealed another layer of movement, deputies forming lines, a handler bending to check the dog's reaction, Jake stepping forward with the hesitancy of a man walking through memory. From the air, those gestures became choreography, small, measured, synchronized against the landscape's stillness. Air 7 continued to zoom, searching for the rhythm of the event. The reporter's voice filled the silence, narrating what we were already feeling.
And it seems like there is a woman standing right next to that highway patrol car, moving toward that area. It's an empty, open.
Every sentence hovered between observation and speculation. The helicopter was both witness and interpreter, hovering just far enough to remain impartial yet close enough to see the truth without hearing it. From the ground, the scene looked procedural. From above, it felt monumental, an entire investigation reduced to movement across a sunlit grid of dirt and dust. I remember how the camera drifted wider again, showing the 60 freeway cutting through the valley like a scar. Trucks passed, oblivious, unaware that a search for a missing infant was unfolding only yards away. The frame held the contrast perfectly, life continuing in one lane, consequence unfolding in another. When the helicopter made its final sweep, the light had shifted to gold, flattening shadows and softening the harshness of the terrain. The field looked peaceful, deceptive in its quiet. The anchor spoke again, her tone subdued now.
And we are waiting for confirmation from law enforcement. At this point, this is simply conjecture as to why they are searching.
That aerial perspective captured what no ground report could convey, the scale of loss against the enormity of place. From the air, it was just a figure in orange surrounded by order. On the ground, it was the end of illusion. The camera pulled back slowly, the image fading into distance, leaving only the echo of rotor blades and the unking question hanging between sky and earth. What truth was buried beneath that silence? They used every resource available, the anchor had said, and I remember thinking about what that meant in a desert like Moreno Valley, where daylight hides more than it reveals. From above, the Air 7 helicopter showed the scale of the terrain, but what it couldn't show was heat. That's where thermal imaging drones should have come in. Night, not day, is when the landscape gives up its secrets. After sunset, the ground cools, the air steadies, and residual heat begins to outline what the eye cannot see. Every object, every patch of disturbed soil, every remnant of human presence glows faintly against the dark. When I reviewed the footage of the daytime search, I kept wondering why no thermal drones had been visible. The field was vast, intersected by low ridges and overgrown gullies where even a helicopter's spotlight would miss detail. By day, the heat radiating off the dirt levels everything living and lifeless, warm and cold into the same temperature field. But after midnight, the equation changes. Thermal cameras detect contrast, not color. A drone hovering 200 feet above the ground could have scanned those acres in minutes, identifying anomalies invisible to the human eye. A freshly disturbed patch of earth, a small heat pocket trapped under debris, even the faint outline of movement, all of it could have been registered in silence. The technology exists for exactly this kind of search. A high-resolution thermal drone can transmit live feeds directly to command vehicles, mapping temperature signatures in real time. It's not intrusive, it doesn't disturb scent trails or shift the ground. Yet the decision to deploy them often comes late, sometimes too late, after daylight has already flattened the clues. In this case, every report mentioned cadaver dogs, deputies, helicopters, but not drones. We saw that video earlier with the baby's father searching the area again. The reporter said. I listened to those words and felt the gap between human effort and technical precision. Had thermal drones flown that night, the results might have been different. The ground retains warmth and layers, and those layers tell stories that daylight erases. A footprint, a discarded item, even a shallow indentation reflects residual heat, differently from untouched soil. Drones don't rely on light or emotion, they rely on data. And data doesn't forget. The night air in Moreno Valley is dry, still, and clear enough for infrared sensors to map each shift in temperature like a fingerprint on the Earth's surface. When the search ended without discovery, I kept thinking of that lost opportunity. The air was perfect for detection. The valley itself was a laboratory, waiting to be read. If the drones had flown under cover of darkness, they might have turned silence into a signal. Instead, the field remained quiet, untouched by the one tool that could have seen what everyone else had been walking over in plain sight. They had search and rescue crews near the 60 freeway. But what that really meant was the arrival of a specialized SAR team, trained to dissect landscapes with mathematical precision. When I arrived at the edge of the operation zone, the field had already been divided into a series of invisible grids, each square marked by subtle flags, coordinates, and GPS points. It looked chaotic to an untrained eye, yet every line was the product of deliberate geometry. The command unit had drawn the pattern hours before dawn, overlaying drone imagery and topographic data onto digital tablets, turning acres of dust into measurable order. A proper terrain grid is not improvised, it's orchestrated. The SAR team used handheld GPS receivers linked to a master system that tracked their movements in real time. Every member was assigned a sector no larger than a football field, and each was required to sweep it twice, first visually, then tactilely, using metal probes to test for soft ground. From above, their progress resembled a slow motion wave moving east to west, one line of human determination erasing any possibility of oversight. The rhythm was relentless: step, scan, mark, confirm, move forward. I watched them from the boundary fence as the morning heat began to climb. The team leader called out coordinates, his voice steady through the radio chatter. The handlers paused, repositioned, and advanced again. Each flag planted in the soil meant an area cleared, one fraction of uncertainty removed. It was a system built not on emotion, but endurance, professionalism measured by repetition. "They're searching a field off Gilman Springs Road," the broadcast continued, the words floating above the hum of engines and the crunch of boots. To viewers at home, it looked like a simple sweep. On the ground, it was the anatomy of precision. By midday, the grid was half complete. Dust coated their boots, and the scent of dry grass mixed with sunscreen and diesel. The SR specialists never hurried, because in their work, speed breeds error. Each quadrant was logged, photographed, and signed off in the command tent before anyone moved to the next. Drones hovered above the perimeter, sensing coordinates, ensuring that no shadow of terrain escaped the map. What struck me most was their silence. They didn't speculate, didn't speak about guilt or motive. Their mission wasn't to accuse, it was to recover truth, square by square. When the operation paused for hydration checks, I looked back at the land they had already crossed. The flags formed an invisible mosaic. A pattern of human patience spread across a place of uncertainty. The SAR team moved through that grid, as if tracing the outline of a confession written on the earth. Each line they completed brought the investigation closer to clarity, not through revelation but through the slow, disciplined act of eliminating what could no longer be hidden. The search ended with no results. Those were the words that closed the broadcast on August 24, and they summed up a day defined by exhaustion, heat, and diminishing hope. From the outside, it looked like an organized operation, officers in formation, cadaver dogs circling, Jake Haro walking under escort, but from within the perimeter, it felt like an equation that could no longer balance. The failure of that search was not due to indifference or inaccuracy, it was the result of physics, time, and terrain working quietly against the effort. The field off Gilman Springs Road was never a forgiving place to begin with. The ground was open and barren, its surface baked into crust by months of sunlight. There were no trees to mark orientation, no landmarks to measure distance. Every direction looked the same. Wind gusts lifted sand into the air, erasing footprints before they could be logged. Beneath that top layer, the soil was compacted, resistant to probes or soft ground testing. Even trained search teams struggled to maintain reference points, because the environment offered no visual hierarchy, only monotony. In landscapes like this, perspective itself becomes unreliable. The longer the case stretched, the more the elements reclaimed what might once have been evidence. By the time the operation began, more than 2 weeks had passed since the estimated date of death. Heat had sterilized scent trails, insects had dispersed, and the ground's chemical profile had stabilized. For cadaver dogs, that meant almost no volatile organic compounds left to detect. For investigators, it meant every minute in daylight worked against them. Even thermal drones, had they been used, would have struggled to isolate meaningful anomalies under such uniform temperatures. I remember watching the team leader call for a halt around mid-afternoon. The radio chatter grew sparse, the rhythm of boots slowed, and the sun pressed down like a verdict. The land gave nothing back, not a signal, not a disturbance, not a clue. The search ended with no results. the reporter said again. But what that really meant was that nature had won. Barren terrain and passing time had joined forces, sealing the valley in silence. The investigation would move forward, but the earth had already decided to keep its secret. Pressure from Rebecca Haro, who still denies guilt. She is sticking with the not guilty plea for now. Those words, delivered by Banfield with a deliberate tone, drew a line between confession and defiance. Rebecca Haro stood at that line and refused to move. While Jake's decision to plead guilty had reshaped the investigation, hers held the story in suspension. In the courtroom, she looked smaller than the news footage suggested, hair tied back, face pale under the fluorescent lights, but her voice was firm when she answered the judge. There was no hesitation, no tremor, just the calm of someone who believed denial was her last remaining structure of control. To plead not guilty at this stage wasn't naivety, it was calculation. Every defense attorney knows that time itself can become a strategy. By waiting, Rebecca forced the prosecution to bear the burden of proof without the physical evidence that her husband might yet trade for leniency. She is sticking with the not guilty plea. The anchor repeated, but underneath that phrase lay layers of motive self-preservation, fear, perhaps even loyalty to a version of events long collapsed under scrutiny. Her refusal created a dissonance that echoed through the courtroom. Two parents, two realities, one missing child. I watched her demeanor closely as the charges were read. Her posture never changed. Her eyes stayed forward, unfocused, as though the world beyond the bench no longer existed. The judge asked if she understood the potential sentence attached to the charge of murder. She nodded once, a slow motion that looked more like endurance than acknowledgement. Around her, the attorney shifted papers, whispering procedural terms that had lost meaning months ago. Outside, cameras waited to record the moment she left the building, but inside, the silence was heavier than any verdict. Her plea didn't erase the evidence. It simply delayed its consequence. For investigators, it meant the search for Emmanuel's body remained urgent. For prosecutors, it meant a longer fight. Yet, from a psychological view, that plea revealed something deeper. A need to sustain a story, even when all supporting structures had fallen away. To admit guilt would mean confronting, not just the act, but the void it left behind. Denial, in contrast, allowed her to keep the illusion alive a little longer, to exist in a narrative where she was still the victim of circumstance, not its architect. When the session ended, Rebecca was led out quietly, her attorneys shielding her from questions. She is sticking with the not guilty plea for now. The reporter repeated for the evening broadcast, emphasizing for now. That phrase felt intentional, acknowledging that denial often bends under the weight of time. Whether her position will hold until trial is uncertain, but in that courtroom, her silence became its own declaration. She wasn't pleading innocence. She was pleading for the version of herself that still believed in it. He pled guilty, the reporter said. And the question now is whether he will testify against her. That question hung over the courtroom like a blade suspended by silence. Everyone knew the answer, even if no one dared to say it yet. Jake Haro had already crossed the threshold that Rebecca refused to approach. His cooperation was no longer theoretical, it was procedural. When the prosecution filed its motion confirming his plea, they also outlined the conditions: continued assistance, disclosure of evidence, and the possibility of testimony against any remaining defendant. That phrase, any remaining defendant, meant Rebecca. From where I sat, the shift was palpable. The couple who had once stood together behind a single story were now on opposite sides of the same table. The image of Jake walking through the Moreno Valley field, in his orange jumpsuit, came back to me as I watched him in court. This time in a plain shirt, hands folded, eyes lowered. He spoke little, but his presence was enough. The prosecution didn't need theatrics, they had leverage. His testimony could fill the gaps the investigation could not. Those hours between August 5th and August 14th, when Emmanuel vanished into silence. For Rebecca, the prospect of Jake taking the stand was more than betrayal, it was exposure. She had maintained her innocence under the protection of ambiguity. His words could erase that shield. He's fully cooperating. His lawyer had said earlier, and cooperation in this context meant more than sharing locations. It meant aligning with the state's narrative, transforming from suspect to witness, from partner to accuser. Whether driven by guilt, fear, or negotiation, Jake's decision to testify would become the final fracture in their shared facade. I remember the courtroom the day this possibility was first mentioned. Rebecca's expression didn't change, but her stillness became sharper, almost deliberate, as if she understood that silence would soon be weaponized against her. The attorneys on both sides exchanged glances that needed no translation. They knew that once Jake spoke under oath, the dynamics of the trial would shift irreversibly. The prosecution would frame his words as cooperation. The defense would call them self-preservation. Truth would become a matter of proximity, how close his recollection came to the evidence they could verify. The law allows one defendant to testify against another in exchange for reduced punishment. It's a brutal transaction, but an efficient one. In this case, the exchange was already in motion. Jake's plea had set the stage. His appearance in court would deliver the performance that law demanded. When the reporter said, "He may testify against her," it wasn't speculation, it was inevitability. He will take the stand, recount what they agreed to hide, and in doing so, rewrite the ending she tried to control. The courtroom will fall silent as one voice undoes the other, and the truth, fragmented, imperfect, but undeniable, will belong to the one who finally decided to speak.
Yeah, is it ever? Because clearly the biggest mystery here isn't that they did something to baby Emmanuel. We all kind of knew it. It's that where is that child?
That single question is the hinge of the entire case, and deep down, investigators believe that Rebecca may know the answer. Even if she didn't act alone, knowledge leaves traces of phrases spoken too carefully, timelines rehearsed too tightly, silences held a second too long. Her continued plea of innocence doesn't erase those traces, it amplifies them. The one person who can now unlock that silence is Jake. His cooperation isn't just a confession, it's a tool, one that prosecutors can use to press Rebecca into revealing what she has guarded for months. I've seen this pattern before. The person who still claims ignorance begins to unravel not through evidence, but through proximity. If Jake speaks openly in court about their movements, their private conversations, the days before the staged kidnapping, every sentence becomes a mirror for her to confront. Even if she doesn't break publicly, the pressure will tighten privately. They shared the same house, the same car, the same week of vanishing. It is impossible for her not to know something. The investigators understand this, and so the plan is to simply use Jake's cooperation as leverage, not vengeance. His plea may earn him a measure of leniency, but its greater purpose lies in forcing her to face what she has withheld. Maybe he's counting on a lighter sentence in return for information. The legal expert said on air, and that's exactly how the equation works. Every new detail he provides shortens the gap between speculation and proof. The more he speaks, the smaller her refuge becomes. Eventually, she'll have to choose between maintaining her narrative or aligning it with his. The prosecution doesn't need both to confess. They only need one to break the geometry of their shared lie. From a psychological standpoint, forcing truth through a relationship is more effective than interrogation. Rebecca built her defense on emotional distance from the crime, but Jake's testimony collapses that distance. His words, his memories, his physical retracing of the route, they will pull her back into the timeline she's tried to erase. If she truly knows the location, the only way to protect herself from complete isolation will be to disclose it before he does. The irony is sharp. The same partnership that once constructed deception will now dismantle it. Jake, by speaking, becomes the catalyst for her reckoning. Whether she chooses confession or defiance, the information will surface because silence, when surrounded by truth, has nowhere left to hide. Both are now cooperating with investigators, the reporter said, and beneath that sentence, I could already hear the negotiation unfolding. In the legal system, cooperation isn't compassion, it's currency. The prosecutors understand this, and so do the defendants. When the evidence can no longer be denied, but the remains of a victim are still missing, the path forward becomes transactional. It is not about innocence anymore, it is about information. The exchange is silent, but precise, leading us to the burial site, and the state will consider reducing the charge or recommending leniency at sentencing. It is the language of compromise written in legal code, but spoken in human desperation. A general plea deal of this kind requires two intersecting admissions. First, acknowledgement of involvement. Second, verifiable assistance that produces results. For both Jake and Rebecca, that assistance centers on geography, the one thing they both shared, the one thing they cannot fake. Detectives have already mapped the routes, cross-referenced GPS data, and confirmed where the couple traveled in early August. Yet, the exact burial point remains undisclosed. By offering it jointly, they transform what is left of their secrecy into bargaining power. To the court, that gesture represents cooperation. To them, it is a last attempt to retain control over a story that has slipped from their hands. I have watched prosecutors handle such negotiations before. They weigh morality against practicality. A recovered body offers closure, forensic confirmation, and judicial completeness. Without it, even a conviction feels incomplete. Justice, achieved in paper form, not in reality. The state's goal is not to reward the guilty, but to retrieve truth before time erases it entirely. The defense knows this, and so their motion will emphasize remorse, compliance, and emotional stability. The subtext, however, remains clear. This deal exists because something tangible can still be found. If both Jake and Rebecca identify the same location independently, investigators can corroborate their statements instantly. That confirmation strengthens the plea and locks it into precedent. The judge, when reviewing the agreement, will consider it a substantial assistance provision, a clause designed to incentivize cooperation without undermining accountability. It's an uneasy balance, rewarding disclosure while recognizing the cruelty of delay. Still, in practical terms, this is how lost truths return to light. From my perspective, this plea is less about redemption than reciprocity. They withheld a life. Now they must return at least the place where it ended.
Today, he admitted to filing a false police report and to assault causing bodily harm to a child.
When Banfield said, the case shifted from mystery to mechanics. What remains now is direction, a set of coordinates buried beneath guilt and time. If both parents finally speak and the ground yields what it's been hiding, their sentences will shorten, but their silence will end. The trade is stark but inevitable: years exchanged for a body, deception replaced by proof, and two intersecting lives reduced to a single point on a map where truth, at last, can be found. She's due back in court on March 11. The anchor had said, the tone measured but weighted with implication. That date, March 11, has now become more than a procedural milestone. It is the fulcrum of Rebecca Haro's entire defense. A preliminary hearing is not a trial, but in cases like this, it functions as a threshold. It is the point where denial either solidifies into defiance or dissolves into concession. For Rebecca, it is her last clear opportunity to change her mind, to trade silence for cooperation, before the machinery of the court locks into its final rhythm. I remember sitting in the back of the courtroom during the previous session, the air heavy with fluorescent hum and quiet expectancy. Her attorney spoke in low tones, reviewing the timeline, their eyes occasionally meeting hers, as if gauging readiness. But readiness for what? A plea deal had already been outlined for Jake. His cooperation was shaping the next phase. Rebecca's position remained frozen, still, not guilty, still detached from the reality unraveling around her. The prosecution's table was stacked with transcripts, digital exhibits, and sealed motions, each one a piece of evidence ready to become public record once the preliminary phase closed. This hearing will test more than evidence. It will test resolve. By March 11, Rebecca will have seen the discovery documents, the witness lists, and the early forensic summaries. She will know how strong the state's case truly is. That knowledge is a form of pressure that defense attorneys describe as structural collapse the moment a narrative can no longer sustain itself under the weight of verified fact. If she is ever going to reverse her stance, this is the moment to do it. After the preliminary hearing, the case proceeds to trial scheduling, where plea flexibility narrows and every decision becomes strategic rather than personal. Prosecutors often frame such deadlines with precision: offer full cooperation now, disclose, direct, confirm, and the court may consider mitigation. Wait longer, and the incentives vanish. It's a quiet ultimatum cloaked in legal language, but its meaning is plain. The state doesn't want another courtroom confession years later. It wants truth before memory decays and public patience fades. She's due back in court on March 11. The reporter had repeated, but to those who follow the case, that line carries the unspoken question: will she finally speak? If she does, it won't be from remorse alone. It will be because the evidence has outpaced her defense, because Jake's testimony has filled the spaces she tried to leave blank, because every new report edges closer to the burial truth she's tried to suppress. If she doesn't, she risks standing trial alone, abandoned even by the narrative that once protected her. March 11 is not just a date. It's the line between silence and surrender, between the illusion of control and the final, unfiltered weight of consequence.